The year was 1789. The British Empire had begun tightening its grip over the Indian subcontinent, and with it came soldiers, traders, and men of ambition. Among them was Captain Edward Hale, a man known for his discipline and his skepticism of superstition. He did not believe in ghosts. That belief would not last long. The journey to Black Fort took 3 days from the nearest settlement. It stood alone on a hill, surrounded by dense forest that seemed to swallow sound itself. Even the birds avoided it. Edward rode alongside a small escort of local guides. None of them spoke much. "Why is it called Black Fort?" Edward finally asked. The oldest guide, a man named Karim, glanced at the fort in the distance. His face tightened. "Because, Sahib, it does not let light stay for long." Edward scoffed. "Superstitions." Karim said nothing more. By the time they reached the gates, the sun had begun to set. The fort was massive, its stone walls darkened by age, streaked with something that looked almost like dried blood. The gates creaked open on their own. No guards. No movement. Just silence. Edward dismounted. This place was supposed to be occupied. Karim shook his head. "It was, once." "What happened to the soldiers stationed here?" Karim hesitated. Then quietly said, "They stopped leaving." Inside, the air felt wrong. Too cold. Too still. The courtyard was empty, yet Edward could swear he heard faint whispers echoing through the walls. "Search the barracks," he ordered. The soldiers obeyed, though reluctantly. Within minutes, one of them shouted, "Sir, you need to see this." Edward rushed inside. The barracks were in ruins. Beds overturned, furniture broken, but that wasn't what made his blood run cold. On the walls, there were scratches. Hundreds of them. No, thousands. Each one carved deep into stone, forming words. Edward stepped closer, reading them aloud. "Don't let it see you. Stay away from the lantern. It watches at night." His voice faltered. Karim stood behind him, whispering, "We should leave." Edward turned sharply. "Nonsense. This is the work of frightened men, nothing more." But even as he spoke, something inside him began to doubt. Night fell quickly. Too quickly. The sky turned black as if swallowed whole, and with it came a thick fog that crept into the fort like a living thing. Edward lit a lantern. "Stay together," he ordered his men. They gathered in the central hall, their faces pale in the flickering light. Then, a sound. Footsteps. Slow. Dragging. Coming from the corridor. Everyone froze. "Who's there?" Edward shouted. No response. The footsteps stopped. Silence again. Then, a faint glow appeared at the end of the corridor. Another lantern. But no one was holding it. The light floated closer. One of the soldiers whispered, "Sir, that's not possible." Edward stepped forward despite himself. "Show yourself." The lantern flickered. And behind it, a figure emerged. Tall. Thin. Its face hidden in shadow. But its eyes burned like dying embers. The temperature dropped instantly. Breath turned to mist. The figure raised its lantern slowly. And then, it spoke. In a voice that sounded like many voices layered together. "You should not have come." One of the soldiers screamed and fired his musket. The gunshot echoed violently through the fort. The lantern went out. Darkness swallowed everything. For a moment. Nothing. Then, the screaming began. Edward lit his lantern again, hands shaking. One soldier was gone. No trace. No blood. Nothing. Just empty space where he had stood. Karim grabbed Edward's arm. I told you, Sahib, it does not let people leave. Edward's voice trembled for the first time. What is this place? Karim whispered, almost afraid to say it. This fort was built over a prison where traitors were kept. Edward frowned. So? Karim's eyes filled with fear. They were not allowed to die. The lantern in Edward's hand flickered. And for a split second, he saw something behind him. Watching. Smiling. The silence after the scream was worse than the scream itself. Captain Edward Hale stood frozen, his lantern trembling in his hand. The shadows along the walls seemed to stretch, to move, as if they were alive. One of you, answer me, he shouted. No one did. The remaining soldiers huddled together, their courage collapsing under the weight of something they could not understand. Karim spoke softly, but firmly. We cannot stay the night here, Sahib. We must leave. Now. Edward swallowed. His instincts as a soldier told him to stand his ground. But something deeper, older, whispered a different truth. You are not in control here. The gate that would not open. They rushed toward the main gate. The fog had thickened, wrapping around their legs like cold hands trying to pull them back. Open it. Edward ordered. Two soldiers pushed against the massive wooden doors. They didn't move. Again. They tried harder. Nothing. It was open before, one whispered. Karim shook his head slowly. It opens when it wants. Then, a faint glow appeared again. Behind them. The lantern. The rule of the lantern. The floating light drifted closer, silent, patient. Karim's voice dropped to a whisper. Do not look directly at it. Edward frowned. Why? Karim didn't answer immediately. Because at that moment, one of the younger soldiers turned. Just for a second. His eyes locked onto the lantern. And he smiled. Edward's heart stopped. The soldier stepped forward, as if hypnotized. No, stop. Edward shouted. Too late. The soldier walked into the fog, toward the light. Step. 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 Then. Gone. Just like the first. Karim closed his eyes. It sees you when you see it, he said quietly. The mark of the chosen. Edward backed away, breathing heavily. This is madness. But deep down, he knew. This was no madness. This was something else. Suddenly, Edward felt a burning sensation on his wrist. He looked down. There, etched into his skin, was a mark. A symbol. Twisted. Unnatural. As if carved by invisible claws. What is this? He demanded. Karim's face went pale. It has chosen you. The story of the lantern spirit. They retreated into a smaller chamber, sealing the door behind them. Karim finally spoke. Long ago, before the fort was built, this land was used as a secret prison. The worst criminals. The traitors. The forgotten. They were locked underground. No trials. No mercy. And no death. They were left in darkness, Karim said. Starved, broken, until they became something else. Edward listened, unable to interrupt. The guards began to hear whispers, then see lights in the tunnels. Lanterns that moved on their own. And then? Edward asked. Kareem looked directly at him. They started disappearing. The first night. Edward sat in silence. His mind tried to find logic, reason. But there was none. Outside, the sound returned. Dragging footsteps. Closer this time. Thud. 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 The door trembled slightly. Something was on the other side. Breathing. Slow. Heavy. One of the soldiers began to cry. "We're going to die here?" Edward snapped, "Silence." But his voice no longer carried authority. Only fear. The whisper. Then. A voice. Right next to Edward's ear. Soft. Cold. Not human. "You saw me." Edward spun around. No one there. But the lantern's glow seeped through the cracks of the door. Kareem whispered urgently. "It knows you now." The rule they broke. Edward clenched his jaw. There must be a way out. Kareem hesitated. "There is one rule the old stories speak of." Edward looked at him. "Speak." Kareem swallowed. "If the lantern marks you, you must never let it go out." Edward looked at his own lantern. The flame flickered weakly. "What happens if it does?" Kareem's voice barely came out. "It takes your place." The knock. Then. 3 knocks on the door. Slow. Deliberate. Knock. 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 Everyone froze. Edward stepped closer to the door. "Who's there?" A familiar voice answered. From the other side. "Sir, it's me." Edward's blood ran cold. It was the soldier who had disappeared. Kareem grabbed Edward's arm. "Do not open that door." The voice came again. More desperate. "Please, let me in, it's cold." Then. It changed. Deeper. Distorted. "Let me in." The door began to shake violently. The lantern flickered wildly. The mark on Edward's wrist burned like fire. And then? Everything went dark. Darkness. Total. Suffocating. For a moment, Captain Edward Hale thought he had gone blind. Then. A spark. His lantern flickered back to life. Dim. Weak. Barely holding on. The missing door. Edward gasped for breath and looked around. The room was gone. The soldiers were gone. Kareem was gone. He was no longer in the chamber. He stood in a narrow stone corridor. Underground. The walls were wet. Not with water. With something thicker. Darker. The air smelled of decay and something burnt. "This isn't possible," Edward whispered. But he already knew. The fort was no longer obeying the rules of reality. The chains below. As he moved forward, the sound reached him. Clinking. Dragging. Metal against stone. Chains. Edward raised his lantern higher. And froze. Figures. Dozens of them. Chained to the walls. Their bodies were thin. Twisted. Barely human. Some were still. Too still. Dead, perhaps. Others. Moved. Slowly. Painfully. Their heads turned toward him. And their eyes? Their eyes glowed faintly, like dying fire. Edward stepped back. No, this can't be real." One of them spoke. Its voice cracked like dry bone. You came back. The prison that never ended. Edward's heart pounded. Who are you? The figure strained against its chains. We were prisoners. Another voice joined. Then another. Then many. They left us here. In the dark. To rot. Edward shook his head. You're dead. The chains rattled violently. No. A long pause. Then. We were not allowed to die. The lantern's purpose. Edward's lantern flickered again. The flame stretched unnaturally tall. And behind him. That glow returned. The other lantern. Slowly drifting closer. The chained figures began to panic. Some screamed. Some tried to hide. It's here. It found another. Edward turned. But stopped himself. Kareem's warning echoed in his mind. Do not look directly at it. He squeezed his eyes shut. But the light grew stronger. Brighter. Burning through his eyelids. Then. A voice. Not outside. Inside his head. You carry the light now. Edward dropped to his knees. Get out of my mind. The voice continued. Calm. Ancient. We were many, now we are one. The truth of the Spirit. Visions flooded Edward's mind. Flashes. Screams. Darkness. He saw the prisoners. Hundreds of them. Locked underground. Begging for mercy. Then silence. Days passed. Weeks. Months. They starved. Went mad. Turned on each other. And in the darkness. Something was born. Not a ghost. Not a man. But a hunger. A single will formed from many dying souls. And it needed light. The first keeper. Edward gasped as the vision shifted. He saw a guard. Holding a lantern. Walking through the tunnels. The prisoners watched him. Followed him. When his light went out. They took him. And the lantern lit again. Carried by something else. The rule revealed. Edward opened his eyes. Breathing heavily. It needs a bearer, he whispered. The voice answered. Yes. Edward looked at his lantern. The flame steadied. Stronger now. You will guide us. No, Edward said firmly. I will not become one of you. The escape attempt. Edward stood and ran. Through the corridor. Past the chained figures. The tunnel twisted unnaturally. Changing. Shifting. Behind him. The dragging footsteps returned. Faster now. Closer. Run. A whisper came from the walls themselves. Edward turned a corner. And slammed into someone. Kareem. The survivor. Kareem grabbed him. You're alive. Edward nodded quickly. We need to get out, now. Kareem looked at the lantern in Edward's hand. Then at his wrist. The mark had grown darker. Spreading. It's too late, Kareem said. No, Edward snapped. There has to be a way. Kareem hesitated. Then spoke. There is one way. Edward leaned closer. Tell me. Kareem's voice trembled. The lantern must be passed, willingly. Edward frowned. To who? Before Kareem could answer. A scream echoed through the tunnels. Not human. Not entirely. And the ground beneath them began to shake. The awakening. The walls cracked. Chains snapped. The prisoners. The things in chains started breaking free. One by one. Their bodies twisted unnaturally. Stretching. Reforming. Becoming something worse. Kareem whispered in horror. It's waking up. Edward tightened his grip on the lantern. The flame roared. And the voice returned. Stronger than ever. Do not run. We are everywhere. The tunnel filled with light. And shadows. And something massive began to move in the darkness ahead. The tunnel trembled like a living thing. Dust fell from the stones cracked, and the air itself seemed to pulse with something ancient and angry. Captain Edward Hale gripped the lantern tightly. Its flame was no longer weak. It burned bright. Too bright. The awakening of the many. From the darkness ahead. It emerged. Not one creature. But many. Bodies twisted together. Arms stretched unnaturally. Faces fused into one shifting mass. Dozens of eyes opening, closing, all at once. Kareem fell to his knees. Ya Allah, it's them. The thing moved without walking. Sliding. Crawling. Flowing across the ground like a shadow made of flesh. Edward stepped back. This is what they became. The voice answered. From everywhere. From nowhere. We became free. The light it needs. The lantern in Edward's hand flared violently. The creature reacted instantly. It stopped. All its eyes focused on him. The light, it whispered. Edward realized the truth. The lantern was not just a tool. It was bait. It needs me, Edward said. Kareem shook his head in fear. No, it needs your soul. The first attempt. Edward raised the lantern. Stay back. For a moment. The creature hesitated. Its body pulled away slightly. Hope. Just a flicker. But then. It laughed. A horrible, broken sound. You do not control it. The flame in the lantern twisted. Darkened. And Edward felt it. Something crawling inside his mind. The invasion. Memories that weren't his. Pain that wasn't his. Voices. Hundreds of voices. Hungry. Cold. Alone. Edward screamed. Get out. But the voices grew louder. You saw us. You carry us. You are us. The mark spreads. Edward looked at his arm. The black mark had spread past his wrist. Up to his elbow. Moving. Like veins of darkness under his skin. Kareem backed away. I can't help you anymore. Edward looked at him. Fear in his eyes. Don't leave me here. Kareem whispered. If I stay, it will take me too. The choice. Kareem's words echoed. The lantern must be passed, willingly. Edward's breathing slowed. His mind raced. If I give it to someone else, he said slowly, I can be free. Kareem froze. You're thinking wrong. Edward looked at him. Desperate. I don't want to die here. Kareem's voice hardened. Then don't become worse than death. The temptation. The creature moved closer again. Slow. Certain. It is simple, it whispered. Give the light. Walk away. Edward's grip tightened. The lantern felt heavier now. Warmer. Alive. You will live. Edward looked at Kareem. Then at the darkness behind him. Then at the lantern. The breaking point. Suddenly. The ground split open. Hands burst out from below. Dozens of them. Rotting. Clawing. They grabbed Edward's legs, pulling him down. Kareem shouted, "Hold on." Edward struggled. The lantern slipped slightly from his grip. The flame flickered. The creature shrieked. A sound so loud it shook the walls. "Do not drop it." The moment of darkness. The lantern almost went out. Just for a second. The flame dimmed. And in that instant, everything changed. The creature screamed in pain. The hands recoiled. The tunnel trembled violently. Kareem realized something. It fears the darkness too. Edward looked at the lantern. Understanding hit him. It needs the light, but it also fears losing it. The turning point. Edward stood up slowly. Still shaking. Still losing himself. "I don't have to give it away." The voices screamed inside him. "No." Edward raised the lantern high. "I can end this." Kareem shouted, "What are you doing?" Edward's eyes locked onto the flame. "If the light dies." The creature lunged forward. Desperate. Terrified. "We die." The cliffhanger. Edward took a deep breath. The mark had reached his shoulder now. His voice barely human. "Then maybe that's what should happen." Kareem screamed. "No, you don't know what will be released." The flame flickered wildly. The creature rushed toward him. The walls collapsed. The tunnel screamed. And Edward, slowly, lowered his hand toward the flame. The flame trembled. Small. Fragile. Yet everything depended on it. Captain Edward Hale stood at the edge of the collapsing tunnel, the lantern shaking in his hand. The creature, the mass of suffering souls, rushed toward him in desperation. "Do not," it screamed. But Edward had already made his decision. The sacrifice. He looked at Kareem one last time. "Get out of here," Edward said quietly. Kareem shook his head. "There's no escape." "Go." Edward roared. For a brief moment. Silence. Even the creature paused. Edward took a deep breath. And whispered, "Let it end." Then, he blew out the flame. The darkness unleashed. Instantly, everything disappeared. No light. No sound. No ground beneath his feet. Just darkness. Endless. Hungry. Then, screaming. Not from the creature. From everywhere. The voices that once spoke as one now shattered into chaos. Hundreds of souls tearing apart. Kareem collapsed, covering his ears. "What have you done?" The truth revealed. From the darkness, something worse emerged. The lantern had not contained the evil. It had controlled it. Without the light, there was no prison. Only freedom. The new form. A shape formed in the void. Larger. More terrible. No longer bound to the tunnels. No longer needing walls. A voice echoed. Not many. Just one. Stronger. Clearer. "You freed us." Kareem looked around in horror. No, no. The darkness began to rise. Climbing the walls. Spreading through the fort. Escaping. Edward's fate. Edward stood in the void. Alone. Or so he thought. Then, he felt it. Something inside him. Settling. Growing. The mark on his body spread completely. Covering his chest. His neck. His face. His eyes opened. They burned like dying embers. And he smiled. Morning came. For the first time in years. The gates of Black Fort stood open. Karim stumbled outside. Broken. Barely alive. Villagers found him hours later. Shaking. Whispering the same words again and again. Don't light the lantern. When they asked what happened, he never answered. Weeks later, travelers began reporting strange sightings. Not just near the fort, but far from it. A man, wearing old military clothes, walking at night, carrying a lantern. But the flame was black. The final scene. A young traveler stopped on a dark road. Sir, can you help me? The man turned slowly. It was Edward. Or what remained of him. His eyes glowed faintly. His smile unnatural. He raised the lantern. You look lost, he said softly. The flame flickered. And behind him, shadows moved. Many shadows.